Thomas McKenna had already lost everything that mattered: his wife, his savings, his pride. Standing in that dusty auction yard with $27 between him and losing the family ranch, he felt the weight of 3 generations watching him fail. Then came an old fat pig nobody wanted. She was huge, dirty, and could barely walk. Everyone laughed when Thomas spent his last $25 on her. But this pig knew something. She led him to buried treasure on his own land and started attracting powerful men from across the territory. Soon, Thomas had to choose between a fortune and staying true to the animal that saved everything. What did that pig really know? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the McKenna Ranch, illuminating decades of weathered fence posts and sun-bleached barnwood that told the story of 3 generations of hard-working men. Thomas stood on his front porch, coffee growing cold in his calloused hands, watching the wind bend the tall grass in waves across land that had been in his family since 1887. His great-grandfather had built the original homestead with nothing but determination and a belief that this patch of Montana earth could sustain a family for generations. That belief felt fragile now, worn thin by 5 years of drought, falling cattle prices, and the crushing weight of debt that seemed to grow heavier each passing month. The bank notices piled up on his kitchen table like autumn leaves, each one stamped with Joel Hartley's signature and the cold arithmetic of foreclosure. 90 days. That's all the time he had left to come up with $47,000. A sum that might as well have been $47 million given the state of his finances. Margaret would have known what to do. She always did. Even now, 2 years after the cancer took her, Thomas could picture her standing beside him on this same porch, her hand resting gently on his forearm while she spoke with that quiet wisdom that had guided them through 23 years of marriage. She'd loved his land with a fierce devotion that matched his own, spending hours walking the property boundaries, collecting wildflowers, and talking about the stories the earth might tell if it could speak. The wedding ring he still wore caught the morning light as he lifted the coffee cup to his lips. White gold, simple and elegant, just like Margaret had been. She'd insisted they couldn't afford anything fancy when they married, but Thomas had saved for 6 months to buy her something that would last forever. Now it felt like the only permanent thing left in his world, a small anchor in a life that seemed to be drifting away from everything familiar. A car door slammed in the distance, breaking his reverie. Sarah Chun's blue pickup truck kicked up a cloud of dust as it wound down the gravel road toward his house. Sarah had been their closest neighbor for 15 years, a widow herself who understood the peculiar loneliness of working land that had been meant for 2. She'd taken over her husband's veterinary practice after his heart attack, building a reputation as one of the finest large animal vets in the county. More importantly to Thomas, she'd become the closest thing the family he had left. "Morning, Thomas," she called out as she climbed the porch steps, a voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to calming frightened animals. Sarah had the kind of practical beauty that came from years of honest work, silver streaking her dark hair, laugh lines around eyes that had seen both joy and sorrow, hands that were steady whether delivering a calf or offering comfort to a grieving friend. "Sarah." He nodded toward the empty chair beside him. "Coffee's fresh." She settled into Margaret's old rocking chair without ceremony, accepting the steaming mug he brought from inside. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching a red-tailed hawk circle high overhead. This was one of the things Thomas treasured about Sarah. She understood the value of quiet moments, never rushing to fill silence with unnecessary words. "Heard you made quite a splash at the auction yesterday," she finally said, a hint of amusement in her voice. Thomas chuckled, the first genuine laugh he'd managed in weeks. Word travels fast. faster when it involves someone spending their last dollar on a pig that looked like she hadn't walked a mile in her entire life. Sarah turned to study his face. "What were you thinking, Thomas?" He considered the question seriously, rotating the coffee mug between his palms. "Honestly, I wasn't thinking much at all. Saw her standing there, nobody else bidding, and something about the way she looked at me." He shook his head. "Sounds foolish when I say it out loud. Most of the best decisions do." The pig in question was currently rooting around near the old apple tree behind the barn, seemingly content in her new surroundings. Thomas had loaded her into the stock trailer yesterday with considerable effort and the help of 2 auction yard workers, half convinced he'd made the worst financial decision of his life. But watching her now, methodically working her way across a patch of ground with obvious purpose, he felt an odd sense of rightness about the purchase. "She's a big girl," Sarah observed. "What do you figure she weighs?" 400 pounds, maybe. More. The auction sheet said she's 7 years old. Thomas frowned. "Strange thing though, when I was loading her up yesterday, I noticed her hooves. They're in perfect condition. Not what you'd expect from an animal that heavy, who supposedly never exercises." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "Meaning maybe she's not as lazy as she appears." They watched the pig continue her systematic exploration of the yard, pausing occasionally to dig small holes with her snout before moving on. There was something almost deliberate about her behavior, as if she were searching for something specific. "You planning to breed her?" Sarah asked. Thomas shrugged. "Haven't thought that far ahead. Right now I'm just hoping she doesn't eat me out of house and home before." He caught himself before mentioning the foreclosure deadline. But Sarah knew. Everyone in their small community knew about the McKenna Ranch's troubles, though most were too polite to speak of it directly. Bad news traveled even faster than auction gossip in a place where everyone's fortunes were tied together by the unpredictable rhythms of farming and ranching. "Thomas," she said gently, "if you need help, I appreciate that, Sarah. I do. But this is something I need to handle myself." She nodded, understanding the pride that made accepting charity harder than facing ruin. Margaret used to say this. Land had secrets. She said a lot of things. Thomas's voice carried the weight of missing someone whose wisdom he'd relied on more than he'd realized. Used to drive me crazy how she'd spend hours just walking around, poking at rocks and studying old maps she'd found at the library. Said the previous owners had left stories buried in the ground. Maybe she was on to something. Before Thomas could respond, the pig let out a sharp grunt from across the yard. Both humans turned to look, surprised by the urgency in the sound. The animal had stopped digging and was staring directly at them, her dark eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed almost human. "Well," Sarah said after a moment, "she's certainly got personality." The pig held their gaze for another few seconds, then resumed her methodical excavation. Thomas found himself wondering what Margaret would have made of this strange purchase. She'd always believed that everything happened for a reason, that the universe had a way of providing what people needed, even when they couldn't see the bigger picture. It was a comforting philosophy, though one that felt increasingly difficult to maintain as the bills piled up and the auction date drew closer. "I should let you get back to work," Sarah said, standing and stretching. "But Thomas, that pig didn't end up with you by accident. Margaret always said you had good instincts. You just needed to trust them more." After she left, Thomas remained on the porch, thinking about instincts and trust, and the way Margaret used to look at this land like it held answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. The pig continued her exploration, working her way steadily toward the eastern boundary where the old homestead foundation lay, buried under decades of prairie grass and accumulated earth dot as the sun climbed higher. Thomas found himself drawn to watch her progress. There was something hypnotic about her methodical approach, the way she'd pause, sniff, dig a small hole, then move on. By midday, she'd covered nearly an acre in this fashion, creating a pattern of small excavations that followed no logic Thomas could discern. But patterns had never been his strength. That was Margaret's gift, seeing connections where others saw chaos, finding meaning in the spaces between obvious truths. Maybe that's what he'd been missing all these years, trying to force the land to produce according to his timeline, instead of listening to what it might be trying to tell him. The pig looked up from her current dig site and fixed him with that unsettling, intelligent stare. For a moment, Thomas could have sworn she was trying to communicate something important, something that might change everything if he could just learn to listen. 3 days after the pig's arrival, Thomas woke to find her standing at the edge of the old homestead foundation, pawing at the ground with unusual persistence. The morning mist clung to the grass, creating an ethereal backdrop for what appeared to be purposeful excavation. Unlike her previous random digging, this effort was focused on one specific spot, a depression in the earth that had always collected rainwater. Thomas pulled on his boots and walked across the dew-soaked pasture, curious about what had captured the pig's attention so completely. As he approached, she looked up from her work and made a sound he'd never heard before, part grunt, part whine, with an urgency that made the hair on his arms stand up. "What is it, girl?" he asked, crouching beside the hole she'd created. The pig stepped back as if inviting him to take over, her dark eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that felt almost human. Thomas examined the shallow excavation, noting that she'd been careful not to damage whatever lay beneath the surface. His fingers brushed against something that definitely wasn't soil, smooth and flat, with edges that suggested human craftsmanship. Working carefully, Thomas cleared away the remaining dirt to reveal a piece of aged leather, folded and wrapped around something solid. His heart began to race as he lifted the package from its earthen hiding place, noting its considerable weight and the way it had been sealed against moisture with what looked like tree sap. The pig watched intently as he peeled back the protective covering to reveal a rolled piece of paper, yellowed with age and covered in symbols that looked Spanish in origin. Thomas's hands trembled as he carefully unrolled the document, recognizing immediately that this was something extraordinary. It was a map, crude but detailed, showing landmarks that corresponded roughly to his property boundaries. Strange symbols marked various locations with Spanish text that he couldn't read, but somehow looked important. Most intriguing of all, the map appeared to be incomplete, with torn edges suggesting it was part of a larger document. "How did you know this was here?" Thomas whispered to the pig, but she had already moved to another spot about 20 yards away and begun digging again. Thomas spent the rest of the morning researching his discovery, using Margaret's old Spanish dictionary and the laptop computer that had gathered dust since her death. The document appeared to be genuine 18th century Spanish, referencing something called El Tesoro de la Misión Perdida, the treasure of the lost mission. References to oro and plata appeared repeatedly, Spanish words he recognized as gold and silver. The implications made him dizzy. According to local history, Spanish missionaries had established several settlements in this region during the 1700s, but most records had been lost when Mexico ceded the territory to the United States. Stories of buried treasure were common enough in this part of Montana, usually dismissed as folklore designed to attract tourists. But this map felt different, too detailed, too specific to be mere fantasy. By afternoon, Thomas had identified several of the landmarks depicted on the map. The twisted oak tree near his southern property line was clearly marked, as was the rock formation that had always reminded him of a sleeping giant. Most significantly, an X marked a location that corresponded exactly to where the pig had found the map. The rational part of his mind suggested this was coincidence, or perhaps an elaborate hoax left by some previous property owner with too much imagination and time. But as he studied the aged paper and compared its landmarks to his familiar landscape, doubt crept in. The detail was too accurate, the aging too consistent with genuine antiquity. Thomas returned to the homestead site as the sun began to set, finding the pig exactly where he'd left her standing guard over a second excavation. This hole was deeper than the first, and when Thomas knelt to examine it, his flashlight beam revealed something that made his breath catch in his throat. Metal. Definitely metal. Tarnished black with age, but unmistakably crafted by human hands. Working carefully in the gathering darkness, Thomas cleared away enough soil to reveal a small object of the size of a silver dollar. When he lifted it into the flashlight beam, his suspicions were confirmed that it was a Spanish coin, bearing the coat of arms of the Spanish Empire and a date that read 1784. The metal was genuine silver, heavy and substantial in his palm. Even in its tarnished state, Thomas could make out intricate details that spoke of official minting rather than crude forgery. The pig watched his discovery with what Thomas could only describe as satisfaction, then moved to yet another location and began her methodical digging. As darkness fell, Thomas counted no fewer than 6 new excavation sites, each one marked by the pig's careful attention to something buried beneath decades of prairie soil. Back in his kitchen, Thomas spread the map across the table and placed the silver coin beside it, trying to process what he'd discovered. According to his research, Spanish silver of this vintage could be worth hundreds of dollars to collectors, possibly more depending on rarity and condition. But the map suggested this was merely the beginning, one piece of a much larger puzzle. Torn edges of the document haunted him. If this was part of a larger map, where were the missing pieces? And more importantly, what did they reveal about the treasure's location? The single coin represented more money than Thomas had seen in months, but it also raised questions that kept him awake long into the night. Margaret had always insisted that the land held secrets. During their years together, she'd spent countless hours walking the property boundaries, collecting artifacts and studying the local history with an intensity that sometimes worried him. She'd claimed to find pottery shards and old metal objects, though Thomas had never paid much attention to her discoveries. Now he wondered what she might have known that she'd never shared. The pig had settled near the back porch, apparently content after her day of archaeological work. Thomas watched her through the kitchen window, marveling at the intelligence in her eyes and the purposeful way she'd led him to discoveries that could change everything. Tomorrow he would need to make decisions about what to do with his findings, but tonight he allowed himself to imagine a future where the ranch might survive after all died as he prepared for bed. Thomas carefully wrapped the map and coin in Margaret's old jewelry box, placing them in the bedroom safe where she'd once kept her few valuables. The weight of possibility felt almost as heavy as his accumulated debts, but for the first time in years, the weight was hopeful rather than crushing. Outside his bedroom window, the pig lifted her massive head and looked directly at the house, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight like twin promises of secrets yet to be revealed. Thomas fell asleep thinking about Spanish missionaries, buried treasure, and the mysterious intelligence of an animal that seemed to understand more about his land than he'd learned in 3 generations of ownership. Thomas woke before dawn with the anticipation of a man who discovered that his worst day might have been the beginning of his best. The pig was already active in the pre-dawn darkness, a silhouette visible through the kitchen window as she continued her methodical exploration of the property. By the time he'd finished his coffee, she had created 3 new excavation sites, each one precisely placed according to some logic he couldn't fathom. The first site yielded another Spanish coin, this one dated 1782 and bearing different heraldic symbols. Thomas carefully cleaned the silver piece with an old toothbrush, marveling at the craftsmanship that had survived nearly 2.5 centuries underground. The second site revealed what appeared to be a fragment of ornate metalwork, possibly part of a religious artifact or decorative vessel. The third excavation uncovered a small leather pouch containing 7 more coins, all Spanish silver from the late 18th century. By noon, Thomas had accumulated evidence that made the previous day's discoveries look modest. Laid out on his kitchen table, the artifacts told a story of Spanish presence on his land that went far beyond the casual missionary activity recorded in local history books. This wasn't the random loss of a few coins by passing travelers. This was systematic burial, the kind of careful concealment that suggested someone had intended to return for their treasure. The pig's behavior had also evolved, rather than random. Digging, she now moved with obvious purpose from one predetermined location to another, as if following an invisible map. More unsettling, she had begun to wait for Thomas before uncovering her discoveries, standing patiently beside each excavation until he arrived to claim whatever lay beneath the surface. Thomas was photographing the latest find in ornate silver cross that might have belonged to a missionary when he heard a car approaching. Through the kitchen window, he watched Joel Hartley's black sedan navigate the gravel road with the careful precision of a man who didn't want dust on his expensive suit. Quickly, Thomas gathered the artifacts and map, shoving everything into a kitchen drawer just as Hartley knocked on the front door. The banker's timing felt suspicious, though Thomas reminded himself that paranoia was a luxury he couldn't afford. Hartley had been nothing but professional during their foreclosure discussions, even showing what seemed like genuine sympathy for Thomas's situation. "Morning, Thomas," Hartley said as Thomas opened the door. The banker was younger than Thomas by a decade, with the soft features of a man who'd never worked with his hands. His smile seemed forced, and his eyes kept shifting past Thomas toward the interior of the house. "Joe, little early for a social call, isn't it? Business, I'm afraid." Hartley stepped inside without invitation, his gaze sweeping across the kitchen with obvious interest. "I wanted to discuss your situation before things get more complicated." Thomas gestured toward the table, grateful he'd cleared away the evidence of his discoveries. "Coffee? No, thank you." Hartley remained standing, his posture suggesting this wouldn't be a long conversation. "Thomas, I'm going to be direct with you. The bank's position hasn't changed, but I've had some inquiries about your property that might represent an opportunity." "What kind of inquiries?" "A development company out of Denver. They're looking for large parcels in this area. Something about a resort project." Hartley pulled a folder from his briefcase. "They're prepared to offer significantly more than the property's assessed value." Thomas accepted the folder but didn't open it. "How much more?" "Enough to cover your debts and leave you with a substantial profit. You could start fresh somewhere else, maybe something smaller and more manageable." The offer should have felt like salvation, but something in Hartley's manner set Thomas on edge. The banker seemed nervous, almost eager in a way that didn't match his usual professional demeanor. Outside, the pig had positioned herself near the kitchen window, her massive head visible as she watched the conversation with obvious interest. "I'll need time to consider this," Thomas said. "Of course, but Thomas," Hartley's voice carried a note of urgency. "These developers don't usually wait long for decisions. The market for this kind of property can be unpredictable." After Hartley left, Thomas opened the folder to find an offer that was indeed generous, too generous for land that had been appraised as barely covering his debts. The development company was called Sterling Holdings, a name he didn't recognize. Their letterhead was impressive, with a Denver address and corporate language that suggested serious resources. But the timing felt wrong. Yesterday, he'd been facing certain foreclosure, and today, mysterious developers were offering him financial salvation? Thomas had lived long enough to be suspicious of coincidences, especially ones that involved large sums of money appearing exactly when he needed them most. The pig's grunt from outside interrupted his thoughts. She had moved to a new location near the barn, this one marked by a distinctive rock formation that matched one of the symbols on his Spanish map. Thomas grabbed the document from the kitchen drawer and compared the landmarks, confirming what he'd begun to suspect. The pig wasn't randomly digging. She was following the map dot. This excavation revealed the most significant find yet: a metal box about the size of a cigar case, decorated with Spanish religious symbols and sealed with what appeared to be ecclesiastical wax. Inside, Thomas found a collection of items that made his hands shake: more silver coins, several pieces of worked gold, and most importantly, another piece of the map. This fragment was larger than the first, showing more detail and extending the coverage of the documented area. When combined with his original find, Thomas could see that the complete map would cover not just his property, but several surrounding ranches as well. The treasure, whatever it was, had been divided and hidden across a much larger area than he'd originally imagined. The implications were staggering. If the Spanish had buried treasure across multiple properties, and if Thomas was the only person who knew about it, he potentially held the key to wealth beyond anything he dared to imagine. But the incomplete nature of the map also meant he needed to access neighboring land to complete his search. As afternoon faded into evening, Thomas found himself caught between excitement and anxiety. The pig had uncovered evidence of treasure that could solve all his financial problems. But the banker's unexpected visit and the mysterious development offer suggested that others might know more about his situation than they were revealing. Standing on his porch as the sun set, Thomas watched the pig position herself near yet another location marked on the map fragments. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, but also new questions about who else might be interested in his land and why. The Spanish silver in his kitchen drawer represented more money than he'd seen in years, but it also represented the beginning of something much larger and potentially more dangerous than he'd bargained for. Margaret's voice seemed to whisper in the evening breeze, reminding him that the best treasures often came disguised as the greatest challenges. The pig looked up from her latest excavation site and met his eyes across the darkening pasture, her gaze holding secrets that could change everything if he had the courage to trust where she was leading him. Sarah's veterinary expertise had always been something Thomas appreciated in the abstract, but he'd never needed it as desperately as he did now. The pig's continued excavations had revealed enough Spanish treasure to pay off his debts twice over. Yet he found himself more confused than relieved. Something about Joel Hartley's sudden interest and the mysterious Denver developers felt orchestrated, as if forces beyond his understanding were converging on his property. "I'd like you to take a look at her," Thomas said when Sarah arrived Thursday morning. "Make sure she's healthy. Maybe tell me more about her breed." Sarah approached the pig with the careful confidence of someone who'd spent decades reading animal behavior. The massive sow allowed the examination without protest, standing patiently while Sarah checked her eyes, ears, and general condition. What Sarah discovered in the first 10 minutes changed everything Thomas thought he knew about his auction purchase. "Thomas," Sarah said, straightening up with an expression of amazement, "do you have any idea what you bought? An overpriced pig that's smarter than she looks? This is a Mangalitsa pig. Pure breed, probably from championship bloodlines." Sarah ran her hands along the animal's distinctive woolly coat. They're sometimes called the woolly pig because of this curly hair. They were nearly extinct until about 20 years ago. Thomas frowned. "What's that mean in practical terms?" "It means you didn't spend $25 on a pig, Thomas. You spent $25 on what's essentially a living lottery ticket." Sarah pulled out her phone and showed him several photos of similar animals. Breeding females of this quality sell for anywhere from $15,000 to $50,000, sometimes more if they have championship bloodlines. The numbers hit Thomas like cold water. $50,000 was more than enough to save the ranch, pay off his debts, and still have money left over for improvements. But even as relief flooded through him, another emotion followed, a protective instinct that surprised him with its intensity. "She's been leading me to things," Thomas said quietly. "Important things. I'm not sure I can sell her." Sarah studied his face with the same careful attention she'd given the pig. "What kind of things?" Thomas hesitated, then made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week ago. He trusted Sarah more than anyone else in his life, and if he was going to navigate whatever was happening on his property, he needed an ally who understood both animals and people. "Come inside," he said. "I'll show you." The kitchen table display of Spanish artifacts left speechless for nearly a full minute. She examined each piece carefully, from the original map fragments to the most recent gold religious medallion, asking detailed questions about where and how Thomas had found everything. When he explained the pig's role in the discoveries, her expression shifted from skepticism to wonder. "This is impossible," she said, holding up one of the silver coins. "Pigs are intelligent, but they can't read maps or understand buried treasure." "Tell her that." Thomas nodded toward the window, where the pig was visible near her latest excavation site. "Unless—" Sarah paused, studying the map fragments more carefully. "Thomas, what if she's not reading the map? What if she's remembering?" "Remembering? What?" "Scent trails. Mangalitsa pigs have an extraordinary sense of smell, much better than most breeds. If someone had handled these buried items recently, or if there were specific scents associated with the burial sites, she might be able to follow trails that are invisible to us." The explanation was logical, but it raised new questions. Who would have handled them recently? This stuff has been buried for centuries. Maybe someone who knew about the treasure and was planning to retrieve it. Sarah's voice carried a new note of concern. "Thomas, have you considered that you might not be the only person who knows about this?" Before Thomas could answer, they heard the sound of vehicles approaching. Through the kitchen window, they watched two expensive SUVs navigate the gravel road, followed by Joel Hartley's sedan. The convoy moved with the purposeful precision of a planned operation. "Were you expecting company?" Sarah asked. Thomas shook his head, quickly gathering the artifacts and returning them to their hiding place. "Help me get these put away." The visitors were led by a man in his 60s with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. He introduced himself as Augustus Sterling, the same name Thomas had seen on the development company letterhead. Sterling's handshake was firm but brief, his eyes constantly scanning the property with obvious appraisal. "Mr. McKenna, I apologize for the unannounced visit, but I'm flying back to Denver this afternoon and wanted to discuss our offer in person." Sterling's voice carried a slight southern accent and the smooth authority of old money. "I understand Mr. Hartley has presented our proposal." "He has," Thomas said carefully, "but I haven't made any decisions." "Of course not. These things require consideration." Sterling smiled, but his eyes remained calculating. "I was hoping we might walk the property together. Sometimes seeing land through fresh eyes helps a seller appreciate its full potential." The request felt more like a demand, though Sterling's manner remained polite. Thomas found himself agreeing, partly from curiosity and partly because refusing seemed likely to create more problems than cooperation. Sarah fell into step beside them, her presence both comforting and protective. Sterling's questions during their walk were probing and specific. He asked about water rights, mineral rights, and the history of previous ownership with the detailed interest of someone who'd done considerable research. Most concerning, he seemed particularly interested in the areas where the pig had been digging, though he framed his questions as casual observations about soil composition and drainage. "Interesting animal," Sterling commented as they passed near the pig's latest excavation site. "Mangalitsa, isn't she? Quite valuable." The casual, Identification of the pig's breed sent warning signals through Thomas's mind. Either Sterling knew a great deal about rare pig breeds, or he'd done research specifically about Thomas's recent purchase. Neither explanation felt coincidental. "Mr. Sterling," Thomas said, "I appreciate your interest, but I'm not ready to make any decisions about selling. I understand completely." Sterling's smile never wavered. "But I hope you'll consider that development opportunities in this area may be limited. The market can change quickly." After Sterling and his entourage left, Thomas and Sarah stood in the kitchen processing what had just happened. The developer's visit had felt more like surveillance than negotiation, and his detailed knowledge about both the property and the pig suggested preparation that went far beyond normal business interest. "Thomas," Sarah said, "I think you need to be very careful about who you trust right now." "What do you mean?" "That man knew too much about your situation. About the pig, about your financial problems, about the specific features of your land." Sarah moved to the window, watching the dust settle from Sterling's departure. Someone's been feeding him information. The implication was clear, but unwelcome. Joe Hartley was the only person outside of Sarah who knew the details of Thomas's financial situation, and now he was presenting offers from developers who seemed to know everything about the property and its recent discoveries. That evening, Thomas sat on his porch watching the pig continue her systematic exploration of the map-marked locations. Each new discovery brought him closer to financial salvation, but also deeper into a situation he didn't fully understand. The breeding value Sarah had mentioned meant he could solve his problems immediately by selling the pig, but something inside him rebelled against the idea. This animal had appeared in his life at exactly the moment he needed her most, leading him to treasures that could change everything. Whatever intelligence guided her actions felt too remarkable to abandon for mere money. Margaret would have understood. She'd always believed that the most important things in life couldn't be bought or sold, only discovered and protected. The pig looked up from her evening excavation and met his eyes across the darkening pasture. In her gaze, Thomas saw the same quiet wisdom he'd fallen in love with in Margaret, the same patient intelligence that suggested some mysteries were worth more than their solutions. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries and new challenges, but tonight he made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. Whatever treasure lay buried on his land, whatever forces were converging to claim it, he would face them with this remarkable animal at his side. She had chosen him just as surely as he had chosen her, and that bond was worth more than all the Spanish gold in Montana. The formal document arrived by courier on Friday morning, bearing the Sterling Holdings letterhead and enough legal terminology to make Thomas's head spin. What should have been a simple purchase offer read more like a corporate takeover, complete with clauses about mineral rights, archaeological surveys, and immediate possession upon signing. Most troubling was a section that granted Sterling Holdings access to the property for preliminary development assessments, regardless of Thomas's final decision. Thomas was still puzzling over the legal language when he noticed unusual activity near his property line. Two men in expensive outdoor gear were walking his eastern boundary, one carrying what appeared to be surveying equipment while the other took photographs. They moved with the casual confidence of people who assumed they had every right to be where they were. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Thomas called out as he approached, the pig following close behind him with unusual alertness. The older of the two men looked up from his equipment with surprise that seemed genuine. He was tall and lean, with the weathered complexion of someone who spent considerable time outdoors, but his gear was too new and expensive for actual ranch work. "Oh, hello there. We're with Sterling Holdings, doing some preliminary survey work." The man's voice carried the same cultivated authority Thomas had noticed in Augustus Sterling. "I believe Mr. Hartley mentioned we might need access for assessment purposes." "Mr. Hartley mentioned no such thing," Thomas replied firmly. and you're on private property without permission. The second man, younger and more obviously urban despite his outdoor costume, stepped forward with an aggressive posture that immediately raised Thomas's hackles. "Sir, I think you'll find that our contract gives us certain rights regarding property evaluation." "I haven't signed any contract," Thomas interrupted. "Which means you're trespassing." The older man held up a placating hand. "Of course, Mr. McKenna. We certainly don't want any misunderstandings." His eyes shifted to the pig, then to the several small excavation sites visible across the pasture. "Interesting landscaping work you're doing. Ground preparation for something specific?" The question was casual but loaded, suggesting these men knew more about the excavations than they were admitting. Thomas felt the pig press against his leg, her massive bulk providing both comfort and a reminder that he wasn't facing this alone. "Just general maintenance," Thomas said carefully. "Nothing that would interest developers." "Everything interests developers, Mr. McKenna." The younger man's smile was predatory, especially when it involves historical artifacts or mineral deposits. The casual mention of artifacts made Thomas's blood run cold. These men weren't here for routine surveys. They knew about his discoveries. The question was how much they knew and who had told them. "I think you gentlemen need to leave now," Thomas said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd spent his life dealing with difficult animals and stubborn weather. After the Sterling Holdings representatives left, Thomas called Sarah and asked her to come over immediately. The casual way they'd mentioned artifacts suggested surveillance that went far beyond normal business intelligence. Someone was watching his property, possibly with equipment sophisticated enough to monitor his activities from a distance. Sarah arrived within the hour, bringing with her a level of practical competence that Thomas found reassuring. She listened to his account of the morning's encounter with the focused attention of someone parsing important information from casual conversation. "They knew about the artifacts," she said when he finished. "That's not information they could have gotten from Joel Hartley or public records." Which means they've been watching you, probably since before the auction." Sarah moved to the kitchen window, studying the surrounding hills with obvious concern. "Thomas, I think you need to consider that your pig purchase might not have been as random as it seemed." The suggestion was disturbing, but made sense of several things that had bothered him. The lack of other bidders at the auction, the pig's immediate familiarity with his property, and now the sudden appearance of developers who seemed to know everything about his recent discoveries. "You think it was planned?" "I think someone wanted that pig to end up with you, knowing she would lead you to the treasure." Sarah turned from the window with an expression of growing concern. "The question is whether they wanted you to find it so you could keep it, or so they could take it away from you." That afternoon, Thomas decided to test Sarah's theory by following the pig to areas of the property he'd never thoroughly explored. She led him to the northwestern corner of his land, near a creek that had always been too marshy for cattle, but provided water during dry summers. Here, her behavior changed dramatically. Instead of her usual systematic digging, the pig became agitated, pacing back and forth along the creek bank and making distressed sounds Thomas had never heard before. She seemed to be looking for something that wasn't where she expected it to be. Her frustration growing as she covered the same ground repeatedly. Thomas was studying the area when he noticed something that made his stomach drop: fresh tire tracks in the soft earth near the creek, too wide and deep to have been made by farm equipment. Someone with a heavy vehicle had been here recently, and from the looks of the disturbed ground, they'd been digging, following the tire tracks back toward the road. Thomas discovered a gate in his fence line that he'd never seen before. It was professionally installed and equipped with a heavy-duty lock, but the ground around it showed evidence of recent use. Someone had been accessing his property regularly, probably for some time. The pig's agitation made sense now. She'd been leading him to sites where treasure had been buried, but someone else had gotten there first. The question was whether they'd taken everything, or just relocated it to make way for their own plans. Back at the house, Thomas spread out his map, fragments, and tried to correlate them with the areas the pig had shown interest in. A disturbing pattern emerged. The sites where she'd found artifacts were all relatively close to the house, while the areas where she seemed frustrated were near the property boundaries. It looked like someone had been systematically removing treasure from the more remote locations, while leaving enough near the homestead to keep Thomas focused on the wrong areas. "They're playing with me," Thomas told Sarah when she returned that evening, "letting me find enough to keep me interested while they clean out the real deposits." "Not just playing with you," Sarah corrected. "They need you to find everything and document it properly. Then they'll take it all at once." The implication was chilling but logical. Thomas was doing the archaeological work while someone else prepared to claim the results. The legal document from Sterling Holdings suddenly made more sense. They weren't really interested in developing his land. They wanted legal access to search it thoroughly. That night, Thomas sat on his porch with a loaded shotgun across his lap, watching for any sign of unauthorized visitors. The pig had positioned herself near the front gate, her massive head raised in an alert posture that suggested she was listening for sounds beyond human perception. Around midnight, Thomas heard the distant sound of vehicles moving without headlights along the gravel roads that bordered his property. The pig stood up and moved to the edge of the porch, her attention focused on the darkness beyond the barn. Someone was out there, probably watching and waiting for the right moment to move. Margaret's voice seemed to whisper in the night breeze, reminding him that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. The pig looked back at him with eyes that reflected the starlight like twin promises of loyalty and protection. Whatever forces were converging on his land, whatever treasure lay buried in the Montana earth, Thomas McKenna would not go down without a fight. The corporate document in his kitchen drawer might grant Sterling Holdings certain rights, but this was still his land, protected by law and defended by a man who'd already lost everything that mattered most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight he stood guard over the only home he'd ever known, with a remarkable pig as his unlikely ally in a struggle that would determine not just his financial future, but the fate of treasure that had waited centuries to be claimed. The discovery that changed everything came not from the pig's excavations, but from Thomas's own memories. Unable to sleep after the previous night's surveillance, he found himself drawn to Margaret's belongings, stored in the bedroom closet, with the careful preservation of a man not yet ready to let go. Her jewelry box, reading glasses, and collection of historical books had remained untouched since her death, a shrine to a woman who'd believed this land held secrets worth discovering. It was Margaret's journal that he found beneath a stack of library books about Montana territorial history, leather-bound and filled with her careful handwriting. It documented years of research Thomas had dismissed as harmless hobby. But reading her entries now, with the knowledge of what lay buried on their property, revealed a pattern of investigation that was anything but casual. March 15th, found another pottery fragment near the old foundation. Spanish colonial, possibly 18th century. The university archaeologist was dismissive, but I know what I'm seeing. Someone established a significant presence here long before the homestead records indicate. June 3rd, local historian mentions stories about a Spanish mission that disappeared from church. Records around 1790. No official explanation for why it was abandoned, or what happened to the missionaries' possessions. The timing matches my pottery findings. October 12th, contacted the State Historical Society about treasure hunting regulations. If we find significant artifacts, we need to follow proper procedures to maintain legal ownership. Tom thinks I'm chasing fantasies, but I've seen enough evidence to know this land has stories to tell. Entry after entry revealed Margaret's growing conviction that their property held historical significance far beyond its agricultural value. She'd researched Spanish colonial history, studied territorial maps, and even corresponded with archaeologists at the university. Most remarkably, she documented finding several small artifacts that matched perfectly with Thomas's recent discoveries. But it was the final entries that made Thomas's hands shake as he read. January 8th. Someone has been watching the house. I've seen the same vehicle parked on the county road 3 times this week, always during the day when Tom is working. They leave when I approach, but they're definitely surveying our property. January 20th. Tom doesn't believe me about the surveillance, but I know what I've seen. Today I found fresh tire tracks near the creek, too heavy for farm equipment. Someone is accessing our land without permission. February 2nd. I've hidden my research materials where they'll be safe. If something happens to me, I hope Tom will continue what I started. The answers are all here. He just needs to know where to look. Margaret's final journal entry was dated just 3 days before the cancer diagnosis that would claim her life. Within 6 months. Reading her words, Thomas felt the crushing weight of missed opportunities and ignored warnings. She tried to tell him about the surveillance, the trespassing, the significance of her historical research. He dismissed it all as the innocent obsessions of a woman who read too many adventure novels. The journal's back pages contained photocopies of documents Thomas had never seen, territorial surveys, Spanish colonial church records, and most significantly, hand-drawn maps that looked remarkably similar to the fragments he'd discovered. Margaret hadn't just suspected treasure existed on their land. She documented its likely locations with academic precision. One map in particular made Thomas's breath catch. It showed the complete layout of what Margaret labeled Mission San Rafael, including detailed drawings of buildings, gardens, and specifically marked burial sites. The mission's location corresponded exactly to his property boundaries, with the main church positioned where his current house stood. More disturbing were the modern annotations Margaret had added to the historical documents. She'd marked locations where she'd found surveillance equipment, noted license plate numbers of suspicious vehicles, and tracked patterns of unauthorized access to their land. Her research revealed a systematic effort to monitor their property that had been ongoing for at least 2 years before her death. The final document in the collection was a letter addressed to Thomas in Margaret's handwriting, sealed and marked, to be opened only in case of emergency. With trembling fingers, he broke the seal and read words that felt like messages from beyond the grave. My dearest Tom, if you're reading this, it means the time has come for you to learn what I couldn't tell you while I was alive. Our land is the site of a lost Spanish mission, abandoned in 1791 when territorial conflicts made it too dangerous to maintain. The missionaries buried their treasury rather than risk it falling into hostile hands, intending to return when conditions improved. They never returned. The treasure has waited more than 2 centuries for someone worthy to discover it. I believe that someone is you, but you won't be alone in your search. Others know about the mission's history and have been preparing for years to claim what they consider rightfully theirs. The pig I've arranged for you to purchase will be your guide. Her breeding line has been carefully preserved by people who understand the treasure's location and significance. Trust her instincts. She knows things that maps and documents cannot reveal. Be careful whom you trust. Joel Hartley is not the friend he appears to be, and the financial difficulties you'll face after my death are not accidental. Everything has been orchestrated to force you into a position where you'll have no choice but to accept help from people who don't have your best interests at heart. I love you more than words can express, and I believe in your strength to see this through. The treasure belongs to our family not because we found it, but because we've been chosen to protect it. Don't let them take what's rightfully ours. The letter was signed with Margaret's characteristic flourish, but included a postscript. That made Thomas's heart race. The key to everything is beneath the floorboard under my jewelry box. What you find there will answer the questions you don't yet know to ask. Working carefully, Thomas pried up the indicated floorboard to reveal a metal strongbox he'd never known existed. Inside, he found documents that recontextualized everything. He thought he knew about his life, his marriage, and his current situation. Margaret hadn't just been an amateur historian, she'd been a professional archaeologist who'd given up her career to marry him and move to Montana. Her research credentials were impeccable, her documentation meticulous, and her understanding of the treasure's historical significance far beyond what any hobby enthusiast could have achieved. More shocking were the legal documents proving that Margaret had known about the planned foreclosure months before Thomas received the first notice. Joe Hartley had been manipulating the ranch's finances for years, artificially creating the debt crisis that now threatened Thomas's ownership. The foreclosure wasn't the result of market conditions or bad luck. It was a deliberate strategy to force Thomas into selling to Sterling Holdings. The final document in the strongbox was a breeding certificate for a Mangalitsa pig named Isabella, purchased by Margaret 6 months before her death and kept at a facility 300 miles away. The pig currently rooting around his property wasn't a random auction purchase. She was Margaret's final gift, trained specifically to help him find the treasure their enemies thought would be theirs for the taking. As dawn broke over the Montana plains, Thomas sat surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that had been years in the making. Margaret had known she was dying, known their enemies were closing in, and used her final months to prepare defenses he was only now beginning to understand. The pig Isabella looked up from her morning excavations and met his eyes with the patient intelligence of an animal who'd been waiting for a human partner to finally comprehend their shared mission. She'd led him to enough treasure to save the ranch, but the real battle was just beginning. The forged document that Joel Hartley presented Monday morning was so expertly crafted that Thomas might have believed it if he hadn't spent the weekend studying Margaret's research. The false deed claimed that Sterling Holdings had purchased mineral and archaeological rights to his property in 1987, years before Thomas and Margaret had bought the land. According to Hartley's paperwork, Thomas owned the surface rights, but nothing beneath the soil. "I'm afraid this changes your situation considerably," Hartley said, spreading the documents across Thomas's kitchen table with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before. "Sterling Holdings has been very patient about exercising their subsurface rights, but recent discoveries on your property have made immediate action necessary." Thomas studied the deed with the careful attention Margaret's training had taught him to apply to historical documents. The paper looked authentically aged, the signatures appeared genuine, and the legal language was precise enough to fool most people. But Thomas had spent 3 days learning to identify the subtle markers that distinguished authentic Spanish colonial documents from clever forgeries. The same techniques applied to modern fakery. "This is interesting work," Thomas said calmly. "The watermarks are particularly convincing. Must have cost Sterling Holdings quite a bit to have this produced." Hartley's confident expression flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Thomas, I understand this comes as a shock, but the documentation is perfectly legal. Sterling Holdings acquired these rights through proper channels decades ago." "From whom?" Thomas asked. "According to county records, the subsurface rights were never separated from the surface ownership. They've been held continuously by the same owners since territorial days. There were some irregularities in the original land grants that created opportunities for separate acquisitions." Hartley's explanation sounded rehearsed. "Sterling Holdings specializes in resolving these kinds of historical complications." Thomas nodded thoughtfully, then reached into Margaret's research box and pulled out a document that made Hartley's face go white. It was the original territorial grant for his property, authenticated by the State Historical Society and clearly establishing unified ownership of all rights, surface and subsurface, in perpetuity. "You're right about historical complications," Thomas said, "but I think you've got them backwards." The confrontation that followed revealed the scope of the conspiracy Margaret had documented. Hartley admitted that Sterling Holdings had been planning this operation for 5 years, ever since their historical research identified the mission site and its likely treasure. They'd needed a local partner with access to banking records and the authority to manipulate property finances. "We offered you a generous way out," Hartley said, his professional demeanor cracking to reveal something uglier beneath. "You could have walked away with enough money to start over anywhere you wanted, with stolen treasure that doesn't belong to you." "It doesn't belong to you either, McKenna. You inherited this land by accident. We found the treasure through years of research and investment." Thomas felt Isabella press against his leg, her massive bulk a comforting reminder that he wasn't facing this alone. "Maybe, but my wife spent the last years of her life making sure you'd never get the chance to take it." Hartley's expression shifted to something that looked almost like fear. "Margaret's dead, Thomas. Whatever she thought, she knew died with her. Did it?" Thomas reached for another document from Margaret's collection. "Because I've got her correspondence with the FBI about interstate fraud conspiracies. Seems she was documenting everything you people were doing, right up until the end." The federal investigation Margaret had initiated before her death had been proceeding quietly for 18 months. Her detailed documentation of the financial manipulation, the surveillance, and the planned treasure theft had provided federal prosecutors with everything they needed to build a case against Sterling Holdings and their local collaborators. What Thomas hadn't expected was learning that Margaret's death hadn't been as natural as the doctors had claimed. The cancer diagnosis was real, but Margaret's research had uncovered evidence that her illness had been accelerated through systematic poisoning. Someone had been adding low-level toxins to her food and medication, hastening the disease's progression while maintaining plausible deniability about its cause. She knew, Thomas said quietly, the full scope of his enemy's ruthlessness finally becoming clear. She knew you people killed her, and she spent her final months making sure you'd pay for it. Hartley stood up abruptly, abandoning any pretense of civilized negotiation. "This isn't over, McKenna. Sterling Holdings has resources you can't imagine and connections that go far beyond one small-town bank. Your wife was a meddlesome amateur who got in over her head. My wife was a professional archaeologist with a PhD from Stanford and 20 years of experience in historical preservation law." Thomas's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd finally understood the true scope of what he was fighting. "She documented every crime you people committed and provided federal prosecutors with evidence that's going to put your entire organization in prison." After Hartley left, Thomas called the FBI contact number Margaret had left in her research files. Special Agent Patricia Vance had been waiting for his call for nearly 2 years, ever since Margaret's death had temporarily disrupted their investigation. The federal case against Sterling Holdings was nearly complete, but they needed Thomas's cooperation to execute the final phase of their operation. "Your wife was remarkable," Agent Vance told him over the phone. "She provided us with evidence of fraud, conspiracy, interstate racketeering, and murder. Sterling Holdings has been operating similar schemes across the western states for decades. What do you need from me? We need you to let them think they're winning. Continue excavating the treasure, document everything you find, and allow Sterling Holdings to proceed with their plans. When they move to take possession of your property and its contents, we'll be ready." The plan was dangerous but elegant. Thomas would serve as bait, using Isabella's guidance to uncover the complete treasure while federal agents documented Sterling Holdings' criminal activities. When the conspirators finally revealed themselves by attempting to seize the treasure through fraud and intimidation, the FBI would have everything needed to dismantle their entire organization. That evening, Thomas sat on his porch reading Margaret's final letter by lamplight. Her words carried new meaning now that he understood the full scope of what she'd been fighting. The treasure belongs to our family not because we found it, but because we've been chosen to protect it. The Spanish missionaries who buried these artifacts trusted that someday someone worthy would discover them and ensure they served their proper purpose. That someone is you, Tom. Not because you're special, but because you're good enough to see this through even when it costs you everything. Isabella looked up from her evening excavations and met his eyes across the darkening pasture. In her intelligent gaze, Thomas saw the same patient wisdom that had drawn him to Margaret all those years ago. Both had been chosen for this purpose, Margaret to prepare the way, Isabella to provide the guidance, and Thomas to see it through to whatever end awaited them all. The federal investigation would culminate within days. But until then, Thomas McKenna would continue the work his wife had begun, protected by a remarkable pig and guided by the memory of a woman whose love had reached beyond death to ensure justice would be served. The conspiracy that had killed Margaret and tried to steal their legacy was about to learn that some battles continued long after the original warriors had fallen. The complete map emerged, like a photograph developing in solution, each new fragment revealing details that transformed Thomas's understanding of the treasure's scope and significance. Working with Isabella's guidance and Margaret's research, he had assembled pieces of the puzzle that had been scattered across his property for more than 2 centuries. What he discovered beneath his family's homestead made the previous finds look like pocket change. The Spanish mission of San Rafael hadn't been a simple frontier church. According to the assembled documents, it had served as a regional treasury, collecting precious metals from mines across what was now Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. When territorial conflicts forced the missionaries to abandon their settlement in 1791, they buried not just the mission's own wealth, but accumulated riches intended for shipment back to Spain. Isabella had led him to the cache's exact location, directly beneath the foundation of the house Thomas's great-grandfather had built in 1887. The irony wasn't lost on him that 3 generations of his family had lived and worked above one of the largest treasure hoards in North American history, never suspecting what lay beneath their feet. The excavation required careful precision to avoid damaging both the treasure and the house's structural integrity. Working by lamplight in the basement, Thomas had removed floorboards and dug through packed earth to reveal a stone-lined chamber that took his breath away. Wooden chests wrapped in oiled leather contained Spanish gold and silver coins by the thousands. Religious artifacts crafted by master artisans gleamed in the flashlight beam crosses, chalices and ceremonial items that belonged in museums, rather than private collections. But it was the mission records, preserved in waterproof containers, that revealed the treasure's true significance. The Spanish had documented their intent that these riches be used for the protection and advancement of those who dwelt righteously upon this blessed land. The treasure wasn't just wealth, it was a trust fund established by 18th century missionaries for the benefit of future generations who would prove worthy of their legacy. Thomas photographed and cataloged everything according to FBI guidelines, creating documentation that would protect the treasure's legal status while ensuring it could be properly preserved. Agent Vance had made clear that his cooperation in the Sterling Holdings investigation would guarantee his ownership rights, but the treasure's historical importance meant it would eventually become part of a museum collection or archaeological preserve. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than the gold itself. Margaret had been right. They'd been chosen as guardians rather than owners, protectors of something that belonged to history rather than any individual family. The money would save the ranch and secure his future, But the true treasure was the opportunity to ensure these artifacts served their intended purpose. Sterling Holdings' final gambit began Wednesday morning with the arrival of armed security. Contractors who claimed to be conducting a court-ordered seizure of stolen property. The forged documents they presented were masterful fakes that might have fooled local law enforcement. But Thomas had spent 3 days coordinating with federal agents, who were monitoring every aspect of the operation. Augustus Sterling himself arrived by helicopter, landing in Thomas's pasture with the theatrical flair of a man accustomed to intimidating opponents through displays of wealth and power. His security team established a perimeter around the property while Sterling marched toward the house with the confident stride of someone claiming what he considered rightfully his. "Mr. McKenna," Sterling announced, "I'm here to resolve this situation once and for all. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises and turn over all artifacts discovered on this property. Any attempt to interfere with our lawful recovery operations will result in criminal charges." Thomas stood on his front porch with Isabella beside him, both of them radiating the calm confidence of people who knew something their opponents didn't. "What lawful operations would those be, Mr. Sterling? The fraud, the conspiracy, or the murder?" Sterling's expression didn't change, but several of his security contractors shifted uncomfortably. Professional mercenaries might be willing to intimidate farmers and seize property based on forged documents, but few wanted involvement in federal crimes that could result in life sentences. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sterling said. "We're here to recover artifacts that were removed from our property without authorization." "Your property?" Thomas held up the authentic territorial grant that proved continuous ownership. "According to federal land records going back to 1885, you've never owned so much as a square inch of this ranch." The confrontation escalated when Sterling's men attempted to enter the house and begin excavating the basement chamber. Isabella positioned herself at the front door with the imposing bulk of an animal, who decided no one would pass without her permission. A normally gentle demeanor transformed into something that reminded the security contractors why wild boars had been feared throughout human history. "That pig is obstructing a lawful operation," Sterling declared. "Remove it immediately." "That pig is protecting her home," Thomas replied calmly. "Same as I am." What Sterling and his associates didn't know was that FBI agents had been monitoring their communications for weeks, documenting every aspect of their planned treasure seizure. Federal surveillance teams were positioned throughout the area, recording conversations and preparing to move when Sterling's criminal conspiracy was fully exposed. The afternoon brought reinforcements from both sides. Sterling Holdings called in additional security contractors and a mobile excavation unit, clearly prepared to remove the treasure by force if necessary. But Thomas had his own backup, arriving Sarah Chun with a carload of neighbors who decided their community wouldn't be intimidated by outside corporate interests. "Whole county's talking about what's happening here," Sarah told Thomas as she surveyed Sterling's small army of contractors. "People remember when your family helped them through hard times. They figure it's time to return the favor." The neighbors included ranchers, shop owners, and retired military veterans who'd served in conflicts that taught them the difference between legitimate authority and corporate bullying. They came armed with cameras, legal observers, and the quiet determination of people defending one of their own against outside threats. Isabella seemed to understand that the final confrontation was approaching. She positioned herself where she could observe all approaches to the treasure site, her intelligent eyes tracking every movement of Sterling's forces. The pig had guided Thomas through discovery, revelation, and preparation. Now she stood ready to help him defend what they'd worked together to protect as evening approached. Thomas felt the same calm that had settled over him during the worst storms of his ranching career. He'd done everything Margaret's research had prepared him to do, cooperated fully with federal investigators and assembled evidence that would destroy Sterling Holdings' criminal enterprise. The treasure was documented, his legal rights were established, and justice was finally within reach. Sterling's ultimatum would expire at midnight, triggering what he believed would be an overwhelming assault that would secure the treasure and eliminate Thomas as an obstacle. But Sterling had made the same mistake that had doomed countless predators throughout history. He'd underestimated the resolve of someone fighting to protect their home, their family legacy, and the memory of a woman whose love had reached beyond death to ensure this moment would arrive. Thomas stood on his porch in the gathering darkness, Isabella at his side and the lights of Sterling's encampment visible across his pasture. Somewhere in the shadows, federal agents waited for the signal that would end a conspiracy years in the making. By dawn, the battle for the McKenna Ranch and its buried treasure would be over, decided by courage, preparation, and the wisdom of a woman who'd seen this day coming long before anyone else understood what was at stake. The assault began at 3:17 a.m. with the systematic precision of a military operation. Sterling's security contractors moved through the darkness using night vision equipment and coordinated communications, surrounding Thomas's house while a specialized excavation team prepared to extract the basement treasure chamber. They'd planned for resistance from local law enforcement and anticipated legal challenges, but they hadn't prepared for the FBI surveillance operation that had been documenting their every move. Thomas watched from his bedroom window as armed figures advanced across his property, their confidence born of superior numbers and equipment. Isabella had positioned herself in the basement directly above the treasure chamber, her massive bulk blocking access to the excavation site. The pig's usually gentle nature had transformed into something primordial and dangerous, a guardian animal defending her territory against invaders. The first indication that Sterling's plan was failing came when his communications specialist reported that all their radio frequencies were being jammed by unknown sources. Federal agents had been monitoring Sterling Holdings' communications for weeks, and now they activated electronic countermeasures that left the assault team operating blind and isolated. "Something's wrong," Thomas heard one of the contractors tell Sterling through the basement window. "We're getting interference on all channels, and I'm seeing movement in the tree line that doesn't match our deployment." Sterling's response revealed the depth of his desperation. "I don't care about complications. Get me that treasure now, before this window closes." The treasure chamber itself proved more challenging than Sterling's team had anticipated. Isabella's protective instincts had triggered something in the pig that transformed her from domestic livestock into a force of nature. When the first contractor attempted to move her aside, she responded with the speed and aggression of a wild boar defending her offspring. The man retreated with torn clothing and a healthy respect for an animal he'd underestimated. "Tranquilize it," Sterling ordered, but his team discovered that Isabella was far too intelligent to be easily subdued. She'd positioned herself where tranquilizer darts couldn't be fired safely without risk of damaging the treasure, and her constant movement made accurate targeting nearly impossible in the confined basement space above ground. Thomas faced his own confrontation with Sterling, who'd abandoned any pretense of legal authority in favor of direct intimidation. The corporate executive had armed himself with a pistol and seemed prepared to use violence if necessary to claim what he considered rightfully his. "You're going to call off that pig and step aside," Sterling demanded, his cultured facade cracking, to reveal something ugly beneath. "This treasure represents years of investment and research. You stumbled into it by accident." "My wife didn't stumble into anything," Thomas replied calmly. "She spent years documenting your crimes and preparing defenses you're only now beginning to understand." Sterling's laugh was bitter. "Your wife was a meddlesome academic who got herself killed by interfering in matters beyond her comprehension. The cancer that killed her was a gift, it saved us from having to dispose of her more directly. The admission of Margaret's murder, recorded by FBI surveillance equipment, provided federal prosecutors with the final evidence they needed to ensure Sterling would spend the rest of his life in prison. But Thomas didn't know about the recording devices. All he heard was confirmation that the woman he'd loved had been murdered by the man, now threatening to kill him. The rage that flooded through Thomas was unlike anything he'd experienced since Margaret's death. For 2 years, he'd struggled with grief, guilt, and the crushing weight of financial ruin, never knowing that his wife's suffering had been deliberately prolonged by the people now trying to steal his legacy. The fury gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. Sterling raised his weapon, but Thomas was already moving with the reflexes of a man who'd spent his life dealing with dangerous animals and unpredictable weather. His tackle sent both men tumbling across the kitchen floor while the gun discharged harmlessly into the ceiling. The physical struggle was brief but decisive. Sterling was 20 years younger, but soft from a lifetime of corporate comfort. Thomas had the wiry strength of someone who'd worked every day of his adult life, and more importantly, he was fighting for everything that mattered to him. When federal agents burst through the front door, they found Sterling unconscious on the kitchen floor, and Thomas standing over him with quiet satisfaction. Thomas McKenna? The lead agent identified herself as Patricia Vance, the FBI coordinator Thomas had been working with for weeks. "We've been monitoring this operation since it began. Sterling Holdings' entire assault team is now in federal custody." In the basement, Isabella had successfully defended the treasure chamber until federal agents could secure the scene. The pig's protective instincts had proven more effective than any security system, and her intelligence had ensured that none of the artifacts were damaged during the confrontation. The Spanish gold cross that Thomas lifted from the treasure chamber as evidence represented more than wealth. It symbolized the end of a conspiracy that had murdered his wife, stolen his peace, and threatened to destroy everything his family had built. The weight of the artifact in his hands felt like justice finally arriving after years of suffering. The federal courthouse in Atlanta buzzed with activity as prosecutors presented evidence that would dismantle one of the largest treasure hunting conspiracies in American history. Sterling Holdings' network extended across 12 states, with connections to corrupt officials, forged documents, and a trail of victims whose properties had been systematically targeted and stolen through fraudulent legal maneuvers. Thomas sat in the witness gallery watching Augustus Sterling face charges that would ensure he'd never see freedom again. Murder, conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, the federal prosecutor's list seemed endless. But it was the testimony about Margaret's poisoning that provided the most satisfaction. Her careful documentation had not only exposed Sterling's crimes, but provided prosecutors with evidence of premeditated murder that elevated the charges to capital offenses. Joel Hartley's cooperation with federal investigators earned him a reduced sentence, but his testimony revealed the scope of Sterling Holdings' operations. The conspiracy had targeted dozens of properties across the western states, using historical research to identify likely treasure sites before manipulating local banks to force foreclosures. Thomas's ranch had been their crown jewel location, where Spanish colonial records suggested the largest treasure cache in North American history. We estimate the total value of artifacts recovered from the McKenna property at between $40 and $60 million, the federal prosecutor told the court. This represents not just monetary wealth, but irreplaceable historical artifacts that belong in museums rather than private collections. The legal resolution was more complex than Thomas had anticipated. While his ownership of the property and its contents was unquestioned, the treasure's historical significance triggered federal preservation laws that required careful handling. The solution satisfied everyone involved. Thomas retained ownership and would receive full compensation, but the artifacts would be donated to the Smithsonian Institution for permanent display in a new wing dedicated to Spanish colonial history. In North America, Isabella's role in the discovery earned her recognition that surprised everyone involved in the case. The Mangalitsa Breed Association declared her a national treasure, and her bloodline would be preserved through a breeding program that ensured her remarkable intelligence would be passed to future generations. More importantly to Thomas, she would remain on the ranch as his companion and partner. Sarah Chen's presence throughout the legal proceedings provided Thomas with emotional support that proved more valuable than any treasure. Their friendship had deepened during the months of crisis, evolving into something that honored Margaret's memory while promising hope for the future. The ranch that had once threatened to bankrupt him was now financially secure, but it was Sarah's partnership that made his future worth anticipating. The new deed that Thomas received from the federal court system was more than a legal document. It was validation of everything Margaret had fought to protect. The McKenna family's ownership of their ancestral land was now legally unassailable, protected by federal guarantees that ensured no future conspiracy could threaten what 3 generations had built. Standing on his front porch that evening, Thomas watched Isabella root contentedly in the pasture where she'd first led him to buried treasure. The pig's work was complete, but her presence remained a daily reminder of the remarkable journey that had transformed him from a desperate widower facing foreclosure into the guardian of one of America's most significant archaeological discoveries. The financial security provided by the treasure's value meant Thomas could restore the ranch to the prosperity it had enjoyed in his grandfather's time. But more importantly, he could honor Margaret's vision of their land as a place where history lived and breathed, where the stories of past generations informed the decisions of the present. Sheriff deputies arrived that evening with official notification that Sterling Holdings had been dissolved by federal court order. Its assets seized to provide restitution for victims across the western states. Augustus Sterling himself faced life imprisonment without possibility of parole. His empire of fraud and murder finally brought to justice by the woman he'd underestimated, and the pig she'd chosen as her instrument of retribution. The community celebration that followed brought neighbors from across the county to acknowledge Thomas's victory over forces that had threatened them all. Corporate predators like Sterling Holdings relied on isolation and intimidation to overwhelm individual property owners. But Thomas's success demonstrated that preparation, courage, and community support could defeat even the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies. As the evening wound down, Thomas found himself alone with Isabella near the old apple tree where she'd made her first excavation. The pig looked up at him with eyes that still held traces of the mysterious intelligence that had guided their partnership from the beginning. Whatever forces had brought them together, whatever purpose had driven their collaboration, the result was justice served and legacy preserved. The Spanish Gold Cross now resided in the Smithsonian's Conservation Laboratory. But Thomas carried something more valuable, the knowledge that love could reach beyond death to protect what mattered most. Margaret's research, preparation, and sacrifice had ensured that their enemy's victory would become their downfall, and her husband would inherit not just treasure, but the satisfaction of seeing justice finally served. 2 years after Isabella first led him to buried treasure, Thomas McKenna stood before a gathering of archaeologists, historians, and dignitaries at the Smithsonian Institution's newest exhibition. The Treasures of San Rafael Mission display occupied an entire wing of the American History Museum, showcasing artifacts that told the story of Spanish colonial presence in North America with unprecedented detail and authenticity. The memorial stone he commissioned stood in the center of the exhibition, bearing Margaret's name alongside a simple inscription, "To those whose wisdom guides us to treasures we never knew we were seeking." Below her name, a smaller plaque honored Isabella, whose intelligence and loyalty proved that the most remarkable partnerships can emerge from the most unexpected circumstances. The breeding program established with Isabella as its foundation had exceeded everyone's expectations. Her offspring demonstrated the same remarkable intelligence that had made her famous, and the Mangalitsa Revival Foundation now maintained breeding facilities across 3 states. Isabella herself remained on the McKenna Ranch, content to spend her days rooting in familiar pastures and occasionally leading visitors to locations where historical artifacts might still be discovered. Sarah Chun had officially become Thomas's partner in both the ranch operations and the historical preservation work that had grown from Margaret's research. Their wedding the previous spring had been a quiet ceremony attended by neighbors who remembered the dark days when corporate predators had threatened to destroy everything the McKenna family had built. The marriage honored both the love Thomas had shared with Margaret and the new chapter that Sarah's presence made possible. The ranch itself had been transformed by the financial security the treasure provided. Thomas had restored the original homestead buildings, upgraded facilities for both cattle and pig breeding operations, and established an educational center where school groups could learn about Montana territorial history. The land that had once threatened to bankrupt him now generated income from multiple sources while serving as a living museum of American frontier experience. Augustus Sterling died in federal prison 18 months into his life sentence. His corporate empire dismantled and his co-conspirators scattered across the federal prison system. Joel Hartley's cooperation with investigators earned him a reduced sentence, but his banking career was permanently destroyed, along with his reputation in the community he'd betrayed. The justice Margaret's research had set in motion proved more thorough and lasting than any revenge could have achieved. The Spanish treasure's true value extended far beyond its monetary worth. The artifacts had rewritten scholarly understanding of Spanish colonial presence in the Northern Territories, providing evidence of mining operations, trade relationships, and cultural exchanges that previous historians had never documented. Margaret's academic training had ensured the discoveries were properly preserved and interpreted rather than simply liquidated for profit. Thomas's relationship with Isabella had evolved into something that defied easy explanation. The pig's intelligence remained extraordinary, but their partnership had settled into the comfortable routine of long-term companions who understood each other without need for words. She still led him to interesting discoveries, pottery shards, old tools, and occasionally artifacts that warranted professional archaeological attention. But their treasure-hunting days were behind them. The federal investigation triggered by Margaret's documentation had exposed corruption that reached into state government, banking systems, and law enforcement agencies across the western United States. The Sterling Holdings conspiracy had been more extensive than anyone imagined, with tentacles reaching into dozens of communities where property owners had faced mysterious foreclosures and development pressures. Thomas's victory had provided justice for victims who'd never understood why their financial situations had suddenly deteriorated. On quiet evenings, Thomas often found himself on the front porch where he'd spent so many hours worrying about foreclosure and watching Isabella's mysterious excavations. The view across his restored pastures now included the lights of Sarah's veterinary clinic, the educational center where tomorrow's visitors would learn about Spanish colonial history, and the breeding facilities where Isabella's descendants continued her legacy of remarkable intelligence. The auction paddle that had started everything hung framed in Thomas's office, a reminder that the best investments often looked foolish at the time. $25 spent on an overweight pig had returned millions in treasure, but more importantly, it had provided the key to understanding Margaret's final gift and ensuring her murderers faced justice. Margaret's presence remained strong. In the evening breeze that stirred the prairie grass, in the satisfaction of seeing her research vindicated, and in the knowledge that their land would remain in family hands for future generations. She'd been right about the secrets buried in Montana soil, But her greatest wisdom lay in understanding that some treasures could only be discovered by people worthy of protecting them. Isabella looked up from her evening rooting and met Thomas's eyes across the pasture with the patient intelligence that had first captured his attention at a livestock auction that seemed like a lifetime ago. The pig had completed her mission, guided him through discovery and danger, and helped him understand that the most valuable treasures were often disguised as the most desperate gambles. Thomas smiled and raised his coffee cup in salute to the remarkable animal that had saved his life, his land, and his future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight he was content to watch the sunset paint the Montana sky in colors that would have made Margaret smile, knowing that love and wisdom could triumph over greed and conspiracy when guided by the kind of intelligence that recognized treasure in the most unlikely places.